Hello, everybody. Thanks for joining us this Friday morning. I'm talking with Seb Rose, and we're going to talk about BDD and how you should do it and why you should do it and when you should do it. And I'm just very excited about today, having gone through some interesting ups and downs with behavior-driven development. Seb, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
Absolutely. Seb, give us a little bit of background about yourself and maybe how you came to do BDD and why I assume you love it, but why do you love it so much?
Okay, so I started off as a developer at high school. I worked on Apple IIs, writing software and compiled BASIC for accountancies. And then I went and did computer science at university. I spent 20 years as a jobbing programmer, developer, architect, designer type, mainly as a freelancer. I then fell in with some bad boys like IBM and Amazon, and I spent a few years working for them before deciding that I wanted to get back out and work for myself again, but this time not as a freelancer, more as a consultant. And at about that same time, I met Matt Wynne. I actually invited him to come and talk at a user group that I run in Edinburgh, in Scotland. And we got talking, and I'd already been using Cucumber, or the 0.1 version of Cucumber for Java. And he works with Aslak, who's porting Cucumber across to Java. And we got talking, and I just carried on with him and helped extend his consultancy and did some training with Matt and Aslak. And along the way, I found more and more reasons to believe that BDD could help businesses deliver, what their customers wanted. And the two things went hand in hand. My customers were happy, and I was getting work. And so when the customers are happy and the person providing the service is happy, it's got to be a good thing.
Got to be a good fit. Well, you hit on the first thing, and that's, the reasons to use BDD. What are the promises that BDD makes to us?
Well, so I'm not sure BDD makes any promises. So let's start there. There's no silver bullets, and there's loads of contextual things that go into it. But the premise of BDD is that most software projects start with the development team not really understanding what the customer wants. And that when we start off developing, we're on a trajectory of learning what this customer wants. And unfortunately, all too often, we learn late in the process. So everyone listening will probably be familiar with that, the graph, or at least the statement from consultants that say it's much cheaper to fix a bug while you're coding than it is to do it in user acceptance testing, and it's 10 times cheaper to fix it in UAT than it is in production. And actually, BDD is actually preloading the whole process by saying, in fact, it's much easier to not write the bug in the first place. It's much cheaper to not write the bug in the first place. So let's spend a little bit of effort, or maybe sometimes quite a lot of effort, sitting down with our customer and really probing into what it is they think they want, and doing it on a very technical level with concrete examples of how the software is supposed to behave. So BDD is really about building an understanding of what the customer wants.
That sounds, it sounds like, it just sounds like almost, it does sound almost like a silver bullet. And I know it's not, it's a lot of hard work, and it takes a lot of time. I'm sure there is no silver bullet, as I agree with you. But this idea of Fred Brooks, I think, said, build two and throw the first one away, right? Yeah. That idea of after you're done building it, you'll know what was actually needed. It sounds like there's a bit of trying to get it right the first time with BDD. Is that true?
So it's certainly around really probing the customer to see if they understand what they're asking for, and getting the development team to understand what that requirement is. So there's certainly no surefire promise that you won't build the wrong thing the first time, but you're more likely to build the right thing if you actually understand what the customer is asking for. And a lot of the certainly a lot of the training work that we do references work that Eric Evans did in the late 1990s. And Eric Evans wrote the very important but equally almost unreadable book, Domain-Driven Design. It's a big book, it's thick, it's quite academic. So a lot of people have it on their shelves, and I don't think many people have gone cover to cover on it. but it comes up with a few really interesting ideas. And one of them is this idea of the ubiquitous language. Because what Eric noticed, and what probably you've noticed, is that if you look at a piece of software that's been developed for a particular application, you don't necessarily see the domain of the problem domain reflected in the solution domain. So if you look at a piece of banking software, unless you knew it was a piece of banking software, you often wouldn't be able to deduce that it was a piece of banking software, because in translating from what the customer has asked for into what the developers think is an appropriate way of implementing it, there's an awful lot of transformations and translations going on. And so in BDD, when we have our first workshops, we're really trying to find a common language that we can talk in, a ubiquitous language where we can shine bright lights in the corners where ambiguity normally lurks. And I often ask customers when I'm training with them, so are there any terms in your domain that are frequently ambiguous? And things like customer and account and date, and even the word version, these are all loaded with imprecision that quite often doesn't surface until quite late in the development process. And you designed a solution that, according to your assumptions of what those words mean, but in fact they can mean different things in different contexts, and you haven't really got down to the detail of them.
Yeah, no, that makes a ton of sense. Somebody from the audience has chimed in and has asked this question. They said, I've never worked with a customer who could articulate what they want. They always think it's my job. How do you get the customer to describe it?
So we don't ask them to describe it. So absolutely, it's a job of both the customer and the development team to get towards the solution. Okay. And so what we do in our first meeting, which we call the Three Amigos workshop, is we use examples to explore what they ask for. So they say, we want a website to do that. And we go, okay, so if I come along to the website and I haven't logged in, would you expect me to have to log in? This is just one example, and we just try and push them further and further with examples. Now, I think the listener who asked the question is absolutely right. Customers often get frustrated with being asked these questions. And at some point, you have to make a decision whether you want to annoy your customer to the point of exasperation, or go away and start working on the system. My observation is that if you go away with questions that are unanswered, then almost certainly you will make the wrong assumptions when you come to deliver it. And your customer will be just as exasperated later on when you deliver something that doesn't match with what they thought they had asked for. So I guess what I'm saying is, keep on asking those questions until you don't think you need any more answers. Now, of course, because BDD is most typically used in agile situations, in agile settings, we're not talking about asking detailed questions about the whole product. So we would start off with a fairly high-level overview of what the product or solution should be trying to achieve. We're only drilling down into stories as and when we're about to bring them into the next iteration, or as and when we're about to start working on them in detail. So we're not asking a zillion questions about everything and trying to come up with a comprehensive set of requirements.
Sorry, the audio cut out just for a second there. I think you said we're not going to ask questions about the entire project up front. We're only going to ask the things we need to do the next sprint, right?
That's right.
But now, Seb, I've worked in an enterprise, and I've owned my own software company. And when I sit down with a client, and I think you hit the nail on the head here, this idea of annoying your client. But I actually had clients who got not just annoyed with all the questions, but they felt like I was trying to shirk my responsibilities. They would say to me, shouldn't you know this? Or they would oftentimes make me feel like I was less of a professional because I was asking too many questions. They said my auto mechanic doesn't ask me all these questions. How do we deflect that kind of attitude when we get that from the customer?
So there's one hard and not very pleasant answer to that, is that there are some customers it's just not worth having. So I know this is hard news, but there are times when you just have to walk away. But in other situations, you have to ask people, really, does your auto mechanic never ask you questions? And if so, why not? Because there are some things about an automobile that are really different from a piece of software that's being built bespoke. Now, if you went down to your auto mechanic and asked him to build you a car specifically just for you, he would ask you a lot of questions. And he would start with what color is the trim, and how many wheels do you want, and what size do you want the wheels? And so those questions would get asked. So this is not a maintenance problem we're talking about. Here we're talking about features that are new or modifications to satisfy business requirements. And so there are many, many different ways you can satisfy those. And so given that, we have to know which way is going to satisfy the customer's requirements. So I'm afraid we have to ask those questions. It's not a question of if, it's a question of when. And if what we do is we ask them late, actually we're doing a disservice to our customer, because they're going to end up either with a shoddy piece of software or paying more than they were expecting to, because they didn't understand how difficult a job they were asking us to do.
Yeah. So let's tie this back in. So we're asking our customers to be specific, and we're asking them to provide examples, right? But especially for those who maybe haven't done behavior-driven development, how does that fit in with the process or the tools and techniques that BDD brings us? Why is it important to ask those questions up front?
So, I mean, essentially, and I'm not sure actually if I'm going to answer the question that you thought you were asking, because the reason it's important to do that is because we need to understand what the customer is asking for. And as your listener indicated in his question, they generally don't. And so until we force them to think about it, neither of us, neither them nor us, will know what they actually want. And when you say forcing the customer to think about examples, we're not forcing the customer to think about examples. So at the core of the BDD process is the Three Amigos workshop. And it's called the Three Amigos workshop, not after some corny comedy film. It's called the Three Amigos workshop because we need three constituencies to be represented at that workshop. We need someone from the customer or the business domain there. We need someone from the development domain, and someone from the test or QA domain. And the reason we need those three different viewpoints present at that meeting is we have very different views on the topic. We have very different skills and experiences. So the customer will know what the business reasons for the request are. The developer will have ideas and understandings about the technical domain, the solution space, the application, the architecture that might be necessary. And the tester will have a lot of experience about how things can be broken. Liz Keogh calls this the evil hat. And between the developer and the tester, we can come up with a lot of examples that challenge the product owner or the customer's understanding of what they're asking for. And at that point, they get a sudden realization, oh yeah, there is, you're right. It doesn't always happen at midnight. When daylight savings happens, it happens at 2 o'clock in the morning. And there are a whole bundle of implicit rules that a business person knows about their domain that until you challenge them with an example of, is this what you're saying? It doesn't come out and you don't learn it. And if you don't know those underlying assumptions, those underlying business rules on which the whole enterprise is founded, you'll deliver something that isn't fit for purpose.
So the Three Amigos meeting is a core part of the process, getting people in alignment to talk about the assumptions and what's the outcome or the deliverable from that meeting. So
the outcome of that meeting is user stories that are understood by everybody everyone in the stakeholder group, so the product owner, the customer, the developers, and the testers. Each user story has a well-articulated set of acceptance criteria, which are rules that have to be satisfied before that story can said to be done. And each acceptance criteria has one or more concrete examples that illustrate that rule in action once it's been delivered. So these examples, they challenge the customer to articulate and refine his understanding of the business rules on which the system works. And they allow us to, in some cases, to break the story into smaller slices so that we can deliver things in a finely grained, iterative and incremental way. And then the final part of the equation is that those concrete examples which we generate to challenge the customer, but also to illustrate the acceptance criteria that we've discovered, they make brilliant candidates for automated tests because they're concrete examples. They talk about what is the context of the system, what data is there, what action takes place, and what is the expected outcome and state of the system at the end.
So is this where the Gherkin format stories come into play, start getting formulated?
So yes, indeed. Now there's, ideally, at the Three Amigos workshop, we will go from the customer or product owner will come with candidate user stories and acceptance criteria. And then over the process of the workshop, having been challenged on using examples to illustrate those acceptance criteria, we'll refine the stories, we'll maybe discover new acceptance criteria, we'll write up concrete examples that illustrate them. And then by the end, we're in a place where we could translate or convert those examples into Gherkin scenarios in the given, when, then format, which are then suitable for automation using Cucumber. In reality, we've probably used up as much of our customers' time as they're prepared to give us by the time we get to the examples. So what I most frequently see, especially when we're dealing with customers or product owners that are not co-located on site, is that the output of the Three Amigos meeting is just takes you down to the examples. And then what typically happens is the developers and the QA or the testers go off and try and turn that into a ubiquitous language statement using given, when, then, which then gets fed back to the product owner. And this is crucial, because if you don't feed it back to the product owner, if the product owner doesn't read those scenarios that you have distilled from the examples that you've worked out with them, then you can't be sure that you've got the language right, and you can't be sure that your understanding is correct. So the feedback that closes that loop of having the product owner read those scenarios is critical. And playing into that space is the fact that the product owner, the customer, is always busier than anything.
Yeah.
And so you have to ensure that your scenarios are interesting to them.
Interesting.
So,
like exciting or like action-packed? What's
not action-packed, but that they deal with problems that the customer understands and recognizes. So quite often, if you let a developer and a tester loose on a set of examples when you're getting down to great detail, we can generate 1,000 test cases around shapes of passwords or lengths of strings. Your product owner is not going to read that. So Matt and I have sort of tried to work out an analogy to try and decide which of these examples should be automated and written up as Gherkin scenarios that get executed by Cucumber, and which of them should probably be left to the developers to implement as unit tests.
I see. Okay.
And essentially, we basically say anything that is of interest to the product owner or the customer should be written up in Gherkin using the ubiquitous language executed by Cucumber, and that will define how your system should work on a fairly high level. It will be thin enough so that the customer feels that he's not wasting his time reading the repetition with very tiny differences between it, but it will be detailed enough to make sure that you haven't misunderstood anything. And then the full breadth of those unit tests and integration tests that the testing pyramid asks us to write, they will be written in JUnit or NUnit or one of your unit testing frameworks, because they're there to support just the technical team. They don't support the customer as such.
Okay, that makes sense. And Seb, your book, tell us you've recently released a book, and I think it's is it cute? Yes, hold up the book. That's right.
There you go. The Cucumber for Java book.
That's right. And in that book, you talk about how these activities produce trust. And that's part of the goal here. And I think I'm starting to see why you say that. If I write some stories and I hand them back to the product owner, and I haven't given him 500 pages full of every kind of password that would be allowed, but instead, and I haven't used examples like the first name is ASDF and the last name is ASDF and the social security number is 123, but instead I've used things that are meaningful to them, that would actually be a trust building exercise. Is that one of the ways that this builds trust?
Absolutely. So, I mean, how do we lose trust? We lose trust by there's an implicit contract between two individuals or two organizations, and in some way we don't deliver on that contract. And what we're trying to do in BDD and a lot of other supporting activities is to put us in a place where we understand enough so that when we make a commitment, we can actually honor that commitment. And for far too long in the software industry, we've had to give fixed price contracts. And what we do is we're going in for competitive tendering.
Right.
And so everyone dives straight for the lowest price. We make promises and we know that we'll be able to sting them later when they have requests for changes in the specification.
Which they always do.
Which they always do. And so what we do, and so the agile promise is, tell you what, we're not going to give you a huge upfront pricing because it's scope that's variable. What we'll do is we'll give you small pieces of the most valuable things that you're looking for, and you pay us on a short-term basis. And if you want to stop, you walk away. And BDD builds on that by saying, you know what, we're not even going to wait to the end of the iteration to find out if what we're doing is right. We're going to, before we even start, we are going to talk you through concrete examples of how the system is going to work, and you tell us if we've understood it correctly.
Yeah, that makes sense. So we've got these stories. We are establishing trust. The PO reads them. The product owner says, I get it. I understand that you have heard what I said and you have accurately reflected back to me. So then they go to engineering. And so I'll tell you, like when I had my company and I introduced BDD to the company, everybody thought, this is driving a headless browser. That's what BDD always is. Is that always the case? Some reading tells me, even in your book, people are testing all kinds of things with this. Is there what kinds of things can we test? Is there with these stories?
Okay, so we typically, we're not testing non-functional aspects with these stories. We're testing behavior of the system, as in the functional aspects of the system. But what I really want to stress is that Cucumber is a tool to support the BDD process. It's not a test automation tool. So you can in fact test anything with Cucumber, because all Cucumber is a very thin executable that reads English language lines, performs some pattern matching to some tagged methods in your Java or your .NET C# code, and executes those methods. So it's really just a calling mechanism to go from a plain text file with English language in it to your Java or C# code. So you can do anything in that C# code. You can ping REST services, you can spin up servers, you can use Selenium to press buttons, or you can call into Java libraries. You can do anything there. So obviously you can test anything there, but there's a cost to maintaining that English language binding, because it's an extra layer that somebody has to curate, maintain, execute, and that cost only has value if you're helping communicate with people that otherwise you wouldn't be able to communicate with. And that's why we say the Cucumber Gherkin scenarios, you write things in there that are of interest to your customers, because typically your customers aren't going to want to sit down with you and look at your IDE and pour through your unit tests output.
Yeah, that makes sense. So when you do this, when you start, I imagine after, let's say you finish sprint 1, you will have a set of Gherkin stories and a set of Cucumber tests that somehow exercise the system, and you will have done that well. And then in sprint 2, you build on that in sprint 3. And so this library of stuff, let's say you do 10 or 20 sprints, it's just getting bigger and bigger and bigger, right? Mm-hmm. I know when I had my company, after about 16 sprints, we were on a project that was 16 sprints. And I guess about halfway through, the developers, we were working in an estimation meeting. And one of them, who was a little cranky about BDD because it felt it added so much code, he said to me, look, the primary mechanism I have right now in this project for estimating is just to look at how many of these BDD stories are going to break. And that's really the only, if I count them, I'll know about how long it's going to take. And it was sort of a slap in the face to me to feel like, wow, this is just adding tremendous overhead. So I feel like in that case, we must have been doing it wrong. What would you say to my team if we could go back in time?
So first thing I'd say is let me have a look at some of your BDD, your Cucumber scenarios. So the thing about Cucumber scenarios is we're trying to write them in a ubiquitous language, and which is rooted in the business domain. And the reason that I've already talked about for doing that is because your customer's got to be able to read them and give you feedback on them.
Got it.
What I quite typically see with these scenarios is you find the scenarios are really quite long, and they are very imperative. They talk about clicking links, filling in text boxes, pressing buttons, and that ties you very much to a particular UI. It ties you very much to a particular page flow, and then when you make a modification somewhere in the system, loads of these scenarios break, and you have to go and refactor them. The thing is, writing these scenarios it needs to be written in the domain language so the customer can understand them, but we need to bring our software development chops to it to make sure that they're well factored and they don't have too much detail. Now, the same complaint that your colleague made around BDD stories is a similar one that gets made around TDD tests as well, unit tests. And both of these complaints stem from a simple, I'm afraid, and common problem, which is that our developers are really bad at writing robust tests. We put in far too much detail and far too much incidental detail. We also write tests that try and do too much. So one of my main training courses is one just around unit testing, and there's an awful lot to learn about unit testing. And it's not about funky stuff in the framework. It's about keeping your tests focused, keeping them testing the behavior, not the implementation. So for instance, in a standard website, you'll have some sort of login page or registering. Let's say registering a user page. And it's important to have at least one scenario for your customer to look at to show that you're capturing the person's name, you're capturing a username, that you're capturing an email and a password. And so there are lots of things that have to be typed in when you're registering. That's great. But then there are other behaviors that will be around the registration process. There'll maybe be a confirmation email sent. There'll maybe be something being set up on a back office CRM system so you can process billing details, et cetera, and we've split those out into separate scenarios, but we don't repeat all the details of registering a new account in each of those scenarios, because that would become repetitive and boring. Repetitive, as developers, we know that breaks the dry rule of do not repeat yourself.
Right.
So what we do is, we take a step back and we say, look, we're beginning to repeat exactly the same steps in scenario after scenario. What's going on here? What is the domain concept that we're finding so interesting? We're registering a new account. So what we do then is we say, let's create this in our ubiquitous language. Let's have a Cucumber step, given I register a new account. And now it's compact. It's localized in one place in the code.
And you hit on something. You said not only does it violate dry, which is a great principle we all know and love from a technical perspective, but you described it as boring.
Yes.
Why is it so? And as soon as you started talking about boring, I remembered that oftentimes the gherkin, we would try and sit with clients and write the gherkin right then with them and get them to look at it and be like, oh, that's great. But that was not actually the same gherkin that would end up getting executed, because the programmer would end up tweaking it, and it would grow and it would change in format, and he would try and, like you said, create some abstractions and things like that. I don't think we ever showed the customer what finally ended up getting executed, because we looked at that as code, not as language to be communicated.
Oh, okay. So because the final payoff of BD done well, which we haven't talked about yet, is that the gherkin that gets written and executed becomes living documentation. So it describes how the system works, and it goes green if your system behaves that way, and it goes red and fails if your system doesn't. And it's absolutely vital that your customer can read that and go, oh, look, you have delivered that. I see you're working on this. This that was working yesterday is not working today. They can go and check this because it's written in plain business language, and it indicates whether the system is behaving the way they expected it to.
So this feels a little bit different than I've heard people talk about TDD, in that not all TDD tests that you write should live forever. And maybe that's a flawed concept. Maybe it's true. Some of them, the idea was some tests can be transient and for a sprint, and some of them should be long-lived. But the idea of this being living documentation feels fundamentally different from that.
So I think, there's two things here. One is, there's absolutely nothing wrong in my book with deleting a test, but very few tests are actually designed to be transient. So you evolve, you recycle them as you go, as your specification gets tighter or as the requirements become better defined. But I'm not a fan of going, these tests haven't failed for a year, let's delete them all.
Right, because, let's just delete them. They don't need to be done.
Well, because that's fine if no one is ever going to touch that part of the system again. Now, what I'd prefer to do is I split. So in Cucumber, anyway, you can use tags. So tags are free-form pieces of text that you can use to annotate your features and your scenarios. And then you can execute Cucumber and provide Cucumber with a Boolean or a logical statement of which tagged scenarios you would like it to run. And so in this way, what we can do is you can tag some as being really important regression tests. You can tag some as being fast and some as being slow. You can tag them with which release they were last modified in. You can tag them with whether they were bug fixes or feature requests. And now you've got a very powerful way of running subsets of your tests. So you don't have to delete any. You can just say, well, for this part of my continuous integration pipeline, I only want to run the fast tests that touch code or touch features that have been modified in the recent release. And now you can keep, even though your suite is very big, your set of scenarios is very big, the actual number of scenarios that you run at each stage of your CI pipeline can be controlled and kept very small.
So do these techniques, do they replace manual testing, regression manual testing, or even exploratory testing?
They definitely don't replace exploratory testing. By definition, exploratory testing is stuff that you can't think of in script up front. To a great extent, I believe we should be aiming to do less, if not no, manual scripted regression testing. So that's not typically achievable. There are some tests that are just too expensive to automate, and so you have to play the cost-benefit trade-off. But if your Cucumber, if your Gherkin suite and your Cucumber tests cover the main application, the ones that you're worried about and concerned about, then I think you've hit most of those regression points. And you will also have a vast number, I hope, of unit tests that will catch regressions as they creep in as well.
So if somebody buys the book and they sit down, they start working through it, it seems to me like there's a period of time between when they start learning these techniques and they start applying them, and knowing if they did it right, like seeing are they achieving this idea of a higher quality, of a better alignment with the customer, of building trust, of having living documentation. How do people know when they're just beginning, if they're doing it right, that they will hit that endpoint? I know when I did it, I feel like we did it as I described, and we didn't really get to that endpoint. I feel like we did it wrong. And there were lots of things to learn, but I wish I would have had some like warning signs up front that maybe I was doing it wrong.
So the book has a chapter called Keeping Your Cucumbers Sweet, and that covers a whole list of anti-patterns of common things that we see customers doing. The truth is, as I'm sure you're aware, that learning almost any skill without having someone who's already learned it next to you is hard. So pianists typically aren't self-taught. Skateboarders hang around with other skateboarders. And if you're trying to learn BDD from a book, you may get lucky the first time, but normally we learn through failure. And that's what's so nice about having someone along who's been on that journey already, because they've already been through those failure modes. For me, the main touch points are, does your customer read your scenarios and give you feedback on it. If you don't get that feedback loop, then you're definitely failing somewhere.
Okay. Yeah, that definitely, had you said that to me 2 years ago, I would have identified that as a great symptom of failure. So Seb, you not only do you write books, but you help people with this, right? How do you help people? Do you come alongside them and be the coach, or what do you do for them?
So I do training courses. So quite often, I run a 3-day training course in-house with teams, and that starts off with a 1-day formal training in a training room. We don't have any computers, and we actually never touch Cucumber. It's all around the Three Amigos workshop. It's all around understanding how to use examples to flesh out and illustrate acceptance criteria. There's a lot about trying to get the story small. There's a lot about involving your product owner in that discussion. And at the end of the day, we try and work out, how is this going to fit into your existing process? Because unless you're starting up a company for the first time, you've already got some sort of software development process, and you can't just come in and change it all. And then the next 2 days, what we do is we start off on day 2, we pick a story off of the backlog, a real story off of the customer's backlog, and we work it in a Three Amigos meeting in the morning of day 2, and we get it really thin, and then the team and I work on it through day 2 and day 3, and we demo it completed at the end of day 3. And for most teams, this is just an eye-opener. The fact that you can take a story, slice it down small, and deliver something of value in less than 2 days, they've never seen it happen before. And at that point, the development team gets enthused, and the product owner gets happy, because they're beginning to see progress really early on. And when you get people working together in that sort of in an environment where everybody's happy, things begin to start taking shape. Then, if possible, ideally, I try and ensure that I can come back 2 or 3 times over the following months to do workshops and reviews of the scenarios that have been written, some of the tooling that's been created as a side effect, the CI process, and just try and keep things on the winning line.
Do you ever have naysayers at the programmers in the class who feel like this is just another fad, another thing that managers want them to do, or whatever the quality soup du jour is, the next big thing, and then at the end they're converted?
So there's always people who have issues with it. Normally it's the product owners that have the most challenges at the beginning.
Really? Not the programmers?
No, generally not. So maybe I've just been lucky, but no, mainly it's the product owners who are nervous about having to provide so much time, so much of their time in the process, when in the past they haven't had to. Developers, there are a lot of issues that there are concerns, especially among teams that have had efforts of using Selenium to automate testing.
Right.
And those teams quite frequently have a history of tests that got very burdensome, that fail erratically and cause a lot of issues. And so they have some issues because BDD, although BDD itself says nothing about what level the tests are going to be at, because the scenarios need to be of interest to the product owner, of the customer, quite often they do end up, or they certainly start off going through the user interface and running on top of the whole application stack. And at that point, we need to introduce really good techniques for automating UI testing. And that's something that in the past, anyway, in many organizations hasn't been done very well.
How do we convince product owners and customers to participate in a more holistic way, to give us more of their time? You stated earlier they were oftentimes the busiest people on the team, right?
So it's a difficult one because there's a trade-off here. They either pay for it upfront by helping, contributing and collaborating in understanding what this product should do, or they pay for it downstream. When it doesn't do it, they lose their customers and they have to pay for rework. And unfortunately, the only way that I've found to do it effectively is to baseline some project and demonstrate what costs were incurred downstream through rework, lost opportunity, cost of delay, and then contrast that with putting the effort in up front. And you have to pick a small project, run it, do some analysis on what the financial outcomes were, and then show them the two numbers. Quite often you'll find one product owner who is prepared to give it a shot. And if you can try it with one product owner and then do the analysis on where the value was, what benefits the team and the organization saw through using this approach, then you can bring other product owners on board by showing them that, in fact, the bottom line is improved by doing like this. It's not a wasteful effort just trying to use up their time. It's a very valuable and cost-effective way of ensuring that what gets delivered is what actually is needed.
So the product owner's time challenged, and I would have thought up front that might be their primary objection to this. But are there other skills, are there other things they need to learn that make this uncomfortable?
Yep. So one of the skills that I think they need to learn, but I think this is a skill that they need to learn for all agile ways of working and not just a behavior-driven approach, is they need to learn to appreciate small steps. So, we're plagued with user stories that are not stories, and certainly are much larger than they should be. We're plagued with product owners and customers who say, I'm not interested in looking at your iterations until you've finished this area.
Right. They don't want to see how the sausage is made, or some analogy to, yeah.
And that's a problem, because what we want to do, the whole agile approach to iteration is to iteratively and incrementally deliver what the customer wants with continual customer feedback. And if the customer says to us, not going to look at it until it's exactly like it's going to look when we ship it, then we're not going to get there. We're still in a waterfall way of working. We internally may be slicing things into iterations, but if the customer doesn't give us feedback on an iteration by iteration basis, we're not going to learn that we've screwed up until way too late.
So, and I'm just going to point out this thing that, as somebody who has spent a lot of time writing software for clients, and my pocketbook is always involved, it is so tempting for me to tell a customer when they don't want to really participate, when we're having very early discussions, saying things like, well, I trust you guys are the experts, I'm sure you don't need that much of my time, you're professionals, I know that you get it. They say these things, and then they hold out money, and it's very easy for me to want to take that money and just think, yeah, this time will be different, I really will get it. But it seems like you said something earlier, and that was this idea that not all customers are great customers. And if you and your company really want to avoid this pain of building the wrong thing, it's really going to benefit you to learn who not to do business with. That seems like an important, or at least start to address those problems really early in the relationship. Yes,
I think that's right. So I have to be absolutely clear here. Most of the consulting and work that I do is either for IT departments or for larger organizations. So I've had plenty of interaction with folks that work in agencies. And specifically, there's an agency that works out of Krakow in Poland. A gentleman called Paweł Brzezinski works there. And they will not deal with people on fixed price contracts. Essentially, they look at the contract and they go, there's just too much uncertainty. If I was going to give you a fixed price, it would be way too high because I have no idea what this involves. And in fact, Pavel's got this wonderful, you'll have seen the poker planning packs that were very much in fashion over the past 10 years with the 0, 1, 2, 3, 5, 8 story points. Well, right. Pavel's got a wonderful deck. It's got 3 cards in it. It's got a 1, it's got a too big, and a no clue. And essentially what he's saying there is that a story is story sized when we can't split it down into anything that's meaningfully smaller.
It's atomic. Yeah. So hold it. That was a 1-pointer. That's the point. A too big or a no clue. That's the only 3 options you get. Yeah. Seems like 2 out of those 3 options you have some work to do.
That's the point. So if you accept, so I mean, obviously the whole point about story points is that they have no relevance in time. But if you can identify a 1 pointer, and then you can say that this is an 8 pointer or a 13 pointer, well, I challenge you to say that you really understand that 8 pointer or that 13 pointer until you actually get into designing and developing it.
Right. All you know is it's bigger, but knowing how much bigger, and you're really asserting it is 8 or 13 times as complicated or whatever. Now, I think that makes a lot of sense. We have another question from the audience. And by the way, if you're listening to us, please ask questions in the Q&A app on Hangout. This person says, how do you see application architecture changing when BDD is applied? Since you would like to test without specifying the interface, do you see the UI being decoupled more from the domain?
So first, I'd love to see the UI decouple from the domain. So I think that the UI is far too infrequently treated as a component. I think you should be able to unit test the UI. So I think that'd be a great thing. But I'm not actually saying, so let's be clear, when I gave the example about registering a new user, that was absolutely true. I think we will end up very quickly with a given statement that says, given I register a new user, that will incorporate and encompass all of those actions that need to go into registering a new user. But I believe that there will be a scenario that delves into the details of registering a new user, that will specify that it needs to have an acceptable username, that will specify that it needs to have an acceptable password and an acceptable email address. So it will talk about the elements that need to be gathered. I don't think it should talk in terms of edit boxes or pressing buttons, but I still think there will need to be a scenario that details what needs to be captured, because the customer wants that to be captured. The customer wants to be able to give feedback on that. Equally, I use the terminology of acceptable username and acceptable password. So for instance, we have, when it comes to usernames, are usernames case sensitive? Are they going to have spaces in them? Are you allowed to use non-alphanumeric characters in them? And all of these questions, you could roll all that up into the register a new user scenario, or you could have a separate scenario which defines what an acceptable username is, defines what an acceptable password is.
But just
sorry,
go ahead.
Which is another abstracting elements of the problem domain. So the problem is, if you wanted to test all of these things in one scenario about registering a user, it would quite quickly become just a mess of text entry fields and different permutations of usernames and characters. Instead, what we do is we say, for now, we speak to the customer, we say, okay, you want someone to register, what information do you want to capture? Username, password, email address, whatever. And we list those out in a single scenario. And if the customer ever changes his requirements about what needs to be captured, then we have one place in the Gherkin deck which we have to change, which is the documentation of what the process of registering a new user is. And we have one place in our test automation code, which is the bit of code that links through to the given I register a new user. So we do have repetition. We've got repetition in two places. Once in the automation code, where we specify the steps we have to go through, and once in the Gherkin, where we document the steps that we have to go through. So, as a developer, I'd love there to only be one place to have to make a change. I can live with two. I can't live with 20 or 200. And so this approach means that we have a documented way that the customer can read, and we have an automated way that we can use whenever we come to register a new user in any other scenario. And this has one extra benefit. So if you write a Gherkin step that says, given I register a new user, the easiest way to implement that in the code is through automating through the UI. You bring up the page, you enter the username, you enter the password, you click the submit button. But you can then change that implementation, and instead you could just connect directly to the SQL database and inject the data for a new customer straight into the database. And now you've registered for a new user in a much more efficient way. No one knows any different. You're still testing the full process, because you've got this scenario that specifies how you register for a new user, and you've got the domain language which just says, I need to register for a new user, but I don't care how you automate that.
But I don't care how you get there.
Yeah.
So it sounds to me like you wouldn't be then continually exercising the UI, but you would be exercising the heart of the story, which is registering a new user.
Correct.
When you work with teams, especially teams new to these techniques, and you said you start with an intensive time and then you follow up, how long have you seen that it usually takes teams to get pretty good at this?
So there is no usually. So I'm afraid I don't have a good answer for that. It's like any skill, you get a lot of payback. There's a steep learning curve, and you get a lot of payback quite quickly, and then it can tail off and take a lot of time. Product owners come and go, team personnel changes. So we're talking weeks and months, not hours and days.
Yeah. Do you find that teams that start this, is it often that they will abandon this? They'll find it too hard. They just can't make the leap.
It's difficult for me to know, because I think those are the teams that I don't get asked back to.
Oh, well, that does make sense. Yeah.
But the teams that I do go back to, there are stumbling blocks. And I would say that the main stumbling block is it's obvious to everybody, which is that there's just not enough time to learn to do things better. This isn't just true of BDD. This is true of test-driven development, continuous integration, you name it. So the trouble is, when we're under pressure, we fall back into the habits that we feel most comfortable with. Right. And those are the things that we've got muscle memory for, the things that we practiced year in, year out. And we probably know that we're doing it wrong, but we just don't feel that we have time to step back and change it.
Sounds like at the beginning of Code Complete, there's a Winnie the Pooh cartoon about him being dragged down the stairs backwards and always thinking there must be a better way, but he can never get his head around what that might be in the moment.
Yes.
So let's go back to the book for a second. Why a book that focuses on Java and the JVM in this particular topic? Why? Are there particular challenges there, or is that just where your interest lies?
So Cucumber was originally written in Ruby for Ruby developers. And then Gojko Adzik, he came along and he did a port using something called, well, he wrote a book called The Secret Ninja Cucumber Scrolls, or something equally bizarre like that. And he had Cuc for Nuke, which was Cuc for Duke rather, which was a linkage that brought JRuby into the JVM platform so that you could run Cucumber on Java software. And Aslak Hausoy, who was the original author of Cucumber in Ruby, went and thought, actually, this isn't very stable. It's really hard for people to use. There's a very large group of Java developers out there who would like to be able to call their Java code natively. So let's port Cucumber to the JVM. And so he wrote Cucumber for Java, or Cucumber JVM as it's called. And the book, the Cucumber book that Matt and Aslak wrote several years ago, was focused on using the Ruby product. Mm-hmm. The Cucumber JVM works in pretty much the same way. It uses Gherkin in the same way, and it has definitely the same philosophy behind it. However, Java is a very different language from Ruby, and the JVM is an environment of its own. So there are significant differences between Cucumber for Ruby and Cucumber for Java. And that's why we wrote this book, to try and address those differences so that the Java community had essentially some examples of how we think you should use Cucumber in the Java stack. Specifically, the differences in Java are around the life cycle and the sharing of data, quite technical level detail differences. So for instance, Ruby shares data through something called a world object, which is globally available, whereas Cucumber uses dependency injection to allow you to inject shared state into different step definitions.
So is this book appropriate and useful for people who are doing non-Java languages on the JVM, like Scala and Clojure and things like that?
So the book's divided into 3 parts. The first part is suitable for everybody on the team. It's not technical. It's around BDD and the overview and the philosophy of it. The second section is a worked example, and it is just in Java. There's stuff in there that you will learn from if you're working on the JVM, but the worked example is in Java. At the end of the book, The third section is appendices, and significant sections of the third section cover things that are of use to people working in all JVM languages. There is a chapter on using Cucumber JVM with Scala and Groovy and Clojure. So that is covered in passing. There's an example of each. It's not in detail.
Okay.
I don't really know that many Scala, Groovy, and Clojure programmers who can't read Java. So I think they probably will get quite a lot out of the book, but there's not a detailed worked example in those non-Java languages.
Okay. We've got another question, and I think it's a really important one, and that is, are there prerequisites you'd want to see a team do before BDD makes sense? For example, this person says, for example, we aren't even doing CI yet. Are there kind of some minimum table stakes that people need to already be doing before they consider BDD practices?
No. Okay. So I wouldn't want to use Cucumber necessarily without having CI in place. But Liz Keogh, so Liz Keogh, I think I've mentioned her before, but Liz Keogh is one of the foundational professionals that's worked in the BDD space. And she has this really nice pithy quote. She says, having conversations is more important than recording conversations, is more important than automating conversations.
Oh, okay.
So actually, just by sitting down and working through examples with your customer, you will get a huge benefit. You don't even have to write it down.
So if all you're doing is the Three Amigos meeting, if you're forcing people to get into a room and come to a clarity of understanding, that has value, even though you're not going to automate it.
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, in fact, typically, when I'm asked how much value, I would say out of the whole process, you'll get 70% of the value just from that conversation.
Wow.
This is the area where we as software developers continually screw up. I'm sorry, that's just what we do. We don't get the right information and everything else goes wrong after that.
So it's not about optimizing communication chains. It's not about 100 other little things. It's about not asking the right questions, not clarifying what they want. It seems to me it requires a certain bravery to sit in front of a client and continue to say, I don't understand, or I don't really get it, and force them to think through it, because it kind of is the opposite of what we as programmers or technical professionals want to be thought of is competent and we get it right from the beginning. Yeah. I mean, doesn't that require something different?
Well, so it certainly requires you to accept that that's the case. So there's some really interesting sociological research that was done, and I think it was done decades ago, where we looked into professionals or just people's comfort with being right or being wrong or being uncertain.
Right.
So if you get asked a question, you'd love to be able to answer it definitively and be right, right? You don't really want to answer it definitively and be wrong.
No.
And you don't really want to say, I don't know. But what the research found was that we far preferred to answer it definitively and be wrong than be uncertain.
No, let me just say that again. So it would be easier. And as a guy who doesn't like to ask for directions when I'm driving with my wife, I'm more likely to assert something that I'm not sure of, where I could be wrong, than I am to admit that I don't know.
Yes.
That's certainly played out in my own life. How do we overcome that?
We have to admit it. And so there's the point. We have to go and say, look, you may think this is obvious, but it really isn't. So for instance, I was in running a 3 Amigo session with a client a few months ago, and the product owner clearly didn't particularly want to be there. And he wanted a feature by which the customer service operator could suspend a user's account.
Okay.
And he said, why am I here? I just want you to be able to suspend the user's account.
Why am I here? It's a great starting point, right?
Exactly. So we said, well, just indulge me, okay? How would you like this to work? And he said, well, I want it to work like in that system over there. I said, okay, how does that system work? I don't know. So we've already started with a basis of make it work like something I don't understand. Okay, and so then we went through and we just started a conversation, and after 5 minutes, one of the developers said, well, you have to go into suspended state. But the suspended state that we've got at the moment allows the customer to go through a lost password process. Is that what you really want? If we suspend them because we think they're fraudulent, do you really want them to be able to reactivate the account? And at that point, the product owner got really engaged, and we opened the board up and we started doing state diagrams of, well, what states should the customer be able to go through and what events take you through those? And this is just a trivial example. And I'm sure that a lot of your listeners deal with software that's far more complex than just having to suspend a single account.
But it was when the product owner saw value, saw that things were not clear. They sort of had to be taken along a path and asked these probing questions until they said to themselves, well, either I don't know or no, that's not right. It became imperative to clarify things.
Yes. So, and this, I think, is something that we see over and over again, where when your customer was sitting there and is going, you guys know all this. It's not, I think the state of mind or the approach is not, customer, you don't know what you're talking about, and not, I'm ignorant, but can you just clarify this? Is this how it works? And at that point, it's quite neutral. And many cases, the customer will go, I'm not sure, because no customer knows everything about the business domain, and they have to go and ask somebody else.
Yeah. I remember reading David Meister's excellent book called The Trusted Advisor. And in there, he talks a lot about the Columbo questioning mindset, where you sort of admit, or you take on the position to say, I might be a little slow here, but could you explain this to me? Making it safe for people to be wrong. And you're kind of taking a position of humility. I always like that kind of approach. And that seems like it might be the kind of thing that would help people to be, to feel more comfortable with this.
Yes, there's a great article online, and I can share you the URL with you later, and you can publicize it. But it's by a colleague of mine called Alan Kelly, and it's called the Dear Customer letter, and it's an open letter to customers of software development departments and companies everywhere. And it basically says, we just don't know, and it's a long letter explaining how it's not possible for us to know, explaining why it is far better to engage in an agile way with low risk and quick iterations than it is to press for a fixed price that is, for us to stay in business, is going to have to be fudged and bolstered somehow.
Yeah, that makes sense. Last question here as we wrap up. Someone is asking, and I think they may have a small shop, but they ask, I'm not sure actually. They say, is BDD appropriate for what they describe as very small projects? What do you think about that? Is there a size metric that says we shouldn't really be having these conversations?
So I don't think it's a size metric. I think it's a question of how close you are to the customer's domain. So if there's no place for you to misunderstand, then it would seem no, that doesn't seem, the whole process doesn't seem appropriate. Equally, if your customer is prepared to look at the unit tests and sit with you while you're coding in the old XP style, then maybe it's not appropriate either. So there are certainly cases where I wouldn't go down this route. Having said that, sorry?
I would say both of those seem rare, at least in my experience.
Exactly. In general, I don't see any problem. I see general applicability for sitting down and asking your customer questions using concrete examples. So for instance, you're always going to sit down and speak to your customer about the requirements. There's always going to be a requirement document. Right. And we will all have been through the experience of reading a requirement document saying, yeah, that's all clear, that makes sense. And then walking away and someone tries to code it and then they come, these two statements contradict. There's no way both of these can be true. And it's only when you get close to it that these discrepancies become obvious. I don't know whether a British comedy program called Father Ted ever made it to the United States?
Doesn't sound familiar, but I'll have to look it up.
Okay, well, there's a brilliant scene in it where it's about priests, and there are two priests in a caravan on a holiday. One of them is slightly dim-witted, and Ted is trying to explain to him the difference between perspective, and there's some cows out of the window, and he's got a toy cow in his hand, and he says, "This is small. That one is far away. Small, far away." and the slow priests in that don't get it. And unfortunately, that's our problem. We look at a specification, and because it's written in a few sentences, the English makes sense, and the domain feels something that we're comfortable with, we go, yeah, that's fine, I understand that. It's only when we get closer to it that we finally see all the gnarly bits around the edges. We see all the complications, all the ways it interacts with the environment. So is this problem really a small problem, or is it just that we haven't got close enough to it yet?
Is it small or is it far away? Brilliant, brilliant takeaway, Seb. Thank you very much. Where can people find you online?
So it's down there underneath my name on the screen. It's claysnow.co.uk. I blog there, and you can find my email address there too.
Excellent, excellent. Clay, Seb, thank you so much for joining us today. It was really interesting, and I honestly wish I had a team of software developers back here that I could go introduce BDD techniques to again, because I feel like I now really understand so much more about its goals and its purposes and the outcomes. Thank you so much for sharing today.
Thank you very much for having me.
Take care.
Bye.